Greetings, friends. I'm very glad that we can meet together today and explore our world and our place in the world and the history that has brought us to this day. I'm speaking to you from here in Richmond, Virginia, where there is much effervescence. There are many, many people out on the streets, despite the quarantine, because there is so much passion in the air, so much concern. And in fact, over the last several days, day after day, statues commemorating historical figures, particularly figures connected with the Civil War, representing the Confederate cause, have been coming down. And the city and state administrations have resolved to take down the remaining monuments to Confederate leaders. So there's much activity. There are many voices that are being heard that until now had not been heard or had lacked a channel to be heard. And conversations are opening up, certainly throughout Richmond, but also throughout this country, the United States, and throughout the world. And these conversations aren't always comfortable conversations or easy conversations. And the demonstrations haven't always gone smoothly. And in fact, in the midst of the demonstrations, we've seen examples of violence that has come up just in the last few days, including most recently in Atlanta, where a African American man was killed, and so there's evidence all around us of a great challenge, and it's not a new challenge. It's a cause of suffering, a cause of unrest that has existed in our societies for a very long time. And it's the intensity of the opening up of this conversation and the poignancy of the tragedies that have unfolded before our eyes that make this conversation so necessary. And as an order, as a movement, therefore, it's undeniably important for us to be part of this conversation and to explore amongst ourselves and within ourselves how we can learn from it all and transform ourselves as we take part in the transformation of the world, God willing. So a process of that kind requires, first of all, that we examine our own history. And that begins with the founding of our movement a century ago. And that's where I would like to turn our attention today. And my words today are just part of a larger conversation that it is important that we all have. And I can only, in these few minutes, allude in the briefest terms to the complex history of our movement, but I would like to note some salient points. And I will also share with you the outline containing these chronological notes for our continued exploration. And my hope is that these notes will stimulate some introspection and collective conversation and, God willing, action between us as we strive more and more to fulfill the mandate to work for the realization of one single humanity in the parenthood of God. So I would frame this conversation in terms of this question: how is it that we find ourselves as a spiritual movement founded by a brown-skinned South Asian man in the capital of the British Empire, a movement that historically has been composed primarily of white-skinned people, and especially women, with significant exceptions, and which is gradually becoming more diverse, while society at large grapples with questions of justice and equity. So that's a way to open into a conversation, to see as a movement we have a certain history. How does that history relate to the larger society to which we belong and the transformations occurring within our own community? In pursuit of this, I would point to these several dates. And the first date is 1737, which is the date that the city of Richmond, where I am now, together with my wife Sartaj, and the Astana is here. The city of Richmond was founded, officially founded in 1737, on land formerly inhabited by the Powhatan Confederacy of indigenous people. It became eventually a major hub of the North Atlantic trade in enslaved people. And it briefly became the capital of the Confederacy. Now, the people who occupied this land, the Powhatan people, were decimated before the establishment of Richmond. And that occurred in the course of colonial encroachment and the military conflicts that encroachment provoked, and also on account of the spread of infectious disease, which proved disastrous throughout North American populations, indigenous populations across North America, resulting in the elimination of something like 90% of the original inhabitants of this land. That's a shocking number when one considers how alarmed we are, and rightly so, at the presence of the coronavirus and its threat to our population today. We see that the infectious diseases that spread in North America at this time, in fact, took 90% of the lives of the original people of this land. And additionally, the military conflicts caused by the that took place in the midst of the encroachment on traditionally occupied land meant that the whole of the Powhatan people was wiped out. So it was here in Richmond following the decimation of the indigenous population, that the city developed, and it developed economically. Its engine became the importation of enslaved people, who were then sent from this place of arrival to other parts of the United States. So that's the history, and we may assume that the Astana, the building that we use as our headquarters, which is one of the older buildings in Richmond, was built by the hands of enslaved laborers. Now I'll go onward to 1783 and beyond. And this was the time when the expulsion, during the Revolutionary War, the expulsion of the British Empire from North America lends momentum to the colonial military expansion in South Asia. In other words, the uprising against British rule in the North American colony meant that imperialism shifted to South Asia, and the British East India Company ramped up its efforts there, which took on eventually a military cast. And so the orientation of the imperialist project shifted from North America to Asia. And then in 1799, Tipu Sultan, who was the ruler of Mysore in southern India, in his fight against colonial incursions in South India, he, in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, he was killed on the battlefield. And he had been an ally of Benjamin Franklin. So there was some contact between the North American founding fathers and Tipu Sultan. He had the Constitution of the United States translated into Persian, but he was killed on the battlefield. And the colonization of the imperial conquest of South Asia continued. He was a primary bulwark against that conquest, but he fell on the battlefield. Meanwhile, back in the United States, in 1848, the spiritualist movement began in upstate New York and was soon to spread throughout the US and Europe. Now, women played an important role in the spiritualist movement, and one way to understand that is that in Victorian culture, women were assigned a passive role. Passivity and renunciation were considered the proper role of women, and there were few outlets for their agency, for their activism. In mediumship, in being a medium for a spiritual seance, a woman could fulfill that expectation of passivity. She would be passive to a spirit, but the spirit's activity within her gave her a voice in society that she otherwise lacked. So there was a paradox in this for women. Spiritualism, in one sense, was very empowering, and women took a leading role in it. And at the same time, that role was circumscribed by the passivity that that mediumship implied. But this was the beginning of the popularization of the occult movement, which developed further into what was eventually to become the New Age. In 1857, going back to India, in 1857, the East India Company had gained paramountcy, and the Mughal emperor was merely a puppet now. And there was an uprising against the British rule in Delhi. And that uprising was vehemently quashed. And in the reprisals that took place, in the destruction that was wreaked on Delhi, the royal family were put to death. The king was exiled. The king was a Sufi. Bahadur Shah Zafar was a murid, and in fact a murshid. He was designated. He had khilafat in our lineage. His murshid, Kalimia, was the murshid of Sayyid Muhammad Hassan Jili Kalimi, who was the murshid of Sayyid Abu Hashim Madani, who was the murshid of murshid. So Kalimia was the murshid in Delhi at that time. He was the teacher of the emperor. And because of that connection, the Dargah and Khanqa of Shah Kalimullah in Old Delhi was completely demolished and destroyed. And the family of the sheikh was scattered or put to the sword. And apparently, there's some confusion in the historical sources, but apparently Kalimia himself was executed. So a primary lineage bearer within our direct silsila, the Khanqa was destroyed and the murshid was put to death. And not so long before Murshid's time. Before this occurred, the Khalifa of Kalimia, Sayyid Muhammad Hassan Jili Kalimi, was given the instruction by Kalimia to go to Hyderabad. Kalimia actually foresaw the destruction of Delhi and sent him to Hyderabad. And there the silsila continued. 1875, back to the US. In an effort to redirect the spiritual movement, which had begun in upstate New York and which involved seances and mediumship, H.P. Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott founded the Theosophical Society. The society advocates universal brotherhood. That is a primary theme of Theosophy, the call for universal brotherhood. But also, the society also propounded a hierarchical race theory, which posited 7 root races, they are called, and which identifies the Aryans as the 5th and current root race, the currently predominant root race. So there was ambivalence or ambiguity or paradox in the racial theory of the Theosophical Society. On the one hand, there was a call for the unification of the human family and for universal brotherhood. At the same time, there was a race theory that was actively propagated, which was hierarchical and which put the Aryan race, so conceived, at the top. In 1882, Inayat Khan is born in Baroda to a family linked to the royal line of Tipu Sultan, who died on the battlefield, and that a family that was jointly engaged in the traditional music and spirituality and culture of India, both the Vedic culture and the Islamic culture of India, but also very much engaged with what was called the new light coming from the West, the new scientific understanding, all that was coming out of the Enlightenment. This family was engaged with it, interested in it. Mola Baksh was interested in new educational models, and he sent his son, Hazrat Inayat Khan's uncle, Alauddin Pathan, to Europe for further studies. And he came back with three-piece suits for all of the children, and the Hazrat Inayat Khan and his siblings wore these three-piece suits and studied the violin and other Western instruments. So they were in two worlds. They were very aware of and interested in Western culture and knowledge, but also completely steeped in the Islamic and Hindu traditions of India and their artistic and spiritual traditions. Then in 1910, Sayyid Abu Hashim Madani, who was of, as I said, of Kalimia's lineage, of that lineage that had been violently disrupted in the colonial encounter, Abu Hashim Madani blessed Hazrat Inayat Khan, saying, "Go, my child, into the world, harmonize the East and the West with the harmony of thy music, spread the wisdom of Sufism, for thou art gifted by Allah, the most merciful and compassionate." In 1910 also, Inayat Khan lands in New York City, reflecting, he says, "I saw before me the welcoming figure of the Statue of Liberty, an idol of rock, which I felt was awaiting the hour to turn into an ideal, awaiting the moment to rise from material liberty to spiritual liberty." So when he saw the Statue of Liberty, this was his thought, that this was an idol that was awaiting the day it would become an ideal. That there was liberty here in this country, but that liberty was not yet perfected. It was not yet realized. There was work to be done to fulfill and spiritualize liberty that is otherwise merely freedom of the market. He envisioned freedom of the spirit. In the following 2 years, he lived in the United States, touring the country with his brother Mahbub Khan and cousin Muhammad Ali Khan. And as dark-skinned men, they were subject to the current segregation laws all over the United States. Facilities were separate spaces for dark-skinned people versus white-skinned people. So they were always required to use those facilities, which were, as we know, inferior facilities that were designated for non-whites. And of course, this was true throughout Murshid's lifetime, which meant that when he was with his murids, when he was traveling and teaching, he was prevented to occupy the same spaces that were available to his students. At the same time, and he traveled through the entirety of the country, not only the more liberal milieu of New York City, but all across the country. He traveled under the burden of these segregationalist laws. And he was portrayed in the media in terms which are really painful to read. And I won't quote the article, which is one of more than one, but I have it in my notes and you may refer to it. But basically it's an article in the Washington Post in 1912 that describes him as a threat to white women. It portrays this dark-skinned preacher as a threat to the safety of young white women who would become enamored of him because of his charisma. So that was the kind of media portrayal that he had to contend with. And we know that he originally he would begin his lectures with a sung invocation in Arabic, and he stopped doing it because people said that, or someone said that he was trying to hypnotize his audience. And so just imagine something so beautiful and sacred, this song, with which as a musician he would begin his discourses. He abandoned it because it was greeted as something menacing and threatening. Now, it was in this time that he was invited to teach at the Tantric Society, which was an organization established by someone, a Western white man interested in yoga and the traditions of India, named Pierre Bernard. And he did teach music at the Tantric Society, and he fulfilled the request of the half-sister of Pierre Bernard, Aura Ray, to give her lessons in music. And she came to love him and wished to marry him. And that was met with utmost opposition by her ward, her half-brother, Pierre Bernard, who was happy to have an Indian teach esoteric methods in his center, and claimed himself to represent these, to represent Tantrism. But when it came to an actual affiliation of marriage, that was something that he adamantly refused. Now, technically, in New York at that time, it would have been legal for the two of them to marry in New York. Although New York was the exception in that regard, in most states it would not have been legal. And in fact, 2 days ago, there was a celebration of what is called Loving Day, which is the striking down of the anti-miscegenation laws throughout the country, which occurred only in 1967. And there's a very touching movie on the subject, by the way, called Loving, which describes which tells the tale of an interracial relationship that occurred prior to that action of the Supreme Court. So there was no legal bar to the marriage, but the whole atmosphere was hostile, and Pierre Bernard threatened violence and legal action. And one can see why Hazrat was not keen to stay in the United States after all that he had experienced in those 2 years. And he and his brothers left by ship. And Aura Ray was so committed and really fearless that she suddenly, without means, left the care of her brother and went alone across the sea and met Hazrat there, and they were duly married in London. So I want to make sure we have time for a fuller conversation. I feel I'm already taking more time than I intended, so I'll try to go faster, speed up. You'll have the notes, so you can examine them at your convenience. In 1918, Hazrat Inayat Khan founds the Sufi order in London. Members are primarily Theosophists, and the order's third object is to help bring the world's two opposite poles, East and West, close together by the interchange of thoughts and ideas, that the universal brotherhood may form of itself, and man may meet with man beyond the narrow national and racial boundaries. So the meeting of human beings beyond nationalism and racism was essential to the cause of the order that Hazrat established. On his second visit to the US, he was detained at Ellis Island and questioned by a tribunal. And he later said, it seemed so contrary to the attitudes of the ancients of welcoming a foreigner as a brother and treating him most kindly in every way, that he may not feel that he is in a strange land. In 1926, Hazrat visited the US for the third and last time, And in New York City, he was welcomed by the Garveyite African-American social reformer, Lady Marie Louise Montague. Garveyite meaning in the tradition of Marcus Garvey, that great civil rights hero. So he was welcomed by the Garveyite social activist Lady Montague, who was the founder and president of the International Humanity League. Montague urges the establishment of the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. And she elects, she proposes, and he is elected, that Hazrat Inayat Khan will lead the world coalition formed by a merger of the Sufi movement and the International Humanity League. The International Humanity League being this African-American led organization based in New York, which was trying to bring about a sense of kinship between all people. A merger took place in 1926 between these organizations. Unfortunately, the fruits of that collaboration were never to be realized because Murshid left this world just some months thereafter, in the beginning of 1927. 1944, Hazrat Inayat Khan's daughter Noor is executed in Dachau after heroically serving the Allied cause, motivated by her opposition to Nazi racism. 1960, John Coltrane is the great jazz musician. John Coltrane is influenced by Hazrat Inayat Khan's mysticism of music and sound. 1976, Muhammad Ali memorizes and recites Hazrat Inayat Khan's prayer, Truth. Then 1970 to 2000, the New Age movement unfolds as a largely white cultural phenomenon, intersecting with Hazrat Inayat Khan's legacy. Hazrat Inayat Khan's legacy flows into and in turn informs the New Age movement. And demographically, as we know, the New Age movement is something that primarily occurred within the white cultural context of North America. 2017, the Inayati Order shifts its North American headquarters to Richmond, Virginia. And 2020, the killing of George Floyd gives rise to a transformative nationwide conversation on race. The Inayatiyya embarks on a process of collective reflection on race, justice, equity, and love.